So the title of this talk, if it had a title, which I guess it does now, but I don't have a slide deck, is installing Solidus into an existing Rails application. So we're all used to working with Solidus on its own, basically. And sometimes we run into a situation where we need to install it into an existing Rails project, sometimes one that's pretty large and has all its own thing going already. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit about what that project was like and a little bit of some of the lessons learned at a high level. I won't be going into the code for fear of showing something confidential and not having more time to prepare, but I think that this does a pretty good job of running down, even just seeing the names of all of the merge requests that we had. So first things first, the existing app wasn't on Rails 6. And before we did all this work, we wanted to upgrade to Rails 6. So check. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, didn't that probably break some of your testing? Wasn't that really difficult? Well, interesting story. There really wasn't much testing on this application, as is often the case when you come into an existing app. Or I should say it was there, but it wasn't really passing. Nobody was running it, all that kind of good stuff. So first things first, we upgraded to Rails 6. This was at the direction of the client as well. And we enabled the CI process. That enabling the CI process was not very straightforward. This was using GitLab CI, but we eventually got it running. And I'll get into it later, but we had some significant issues with how we were doing the caching that I want everybody to be aware of in case you're working on a similar issue and coming up with these kinds of same things. We did a bunch of work getting the README set up and having the setup exactly how we wanted it. Something to call out here would be this import database task that we set up. I think it's a great way to have your production environment running locally, to have a way that you can easily, with one great task, basically dump all of the database, whether using Postgres, MySQL, whatever, dump it, download that locally, restore it in your machine, and sanitize the data to take out anything sensitive with personal identifying information. That allows us to streamline the setup a lot, right? Because in a project like this, I mean, you might be thinking, well, just use the seeds or just use the sample data. But a lot of times at the state that we're at right now, you don't have that. And we didn't have that. So the only way to really get that running locally was to do this database import. It's always a good option. From there, we really needed to make sure the admin was accessible and make sure that we could bring the Solidus engine into the project. So this is a pretty interesting MR, that one on line 70. But again, I can't show it to you for lack of preparation of removing sensitive issues. But really, we're just installing Solidus in the gem file, bundling, running the Solidus installers, adding all the migrations, hooking up the Solidus routes, mounting Solidus at a mounting point, which we did at just /store, as is typical. Obviously, when you're installing Solidus into an existing app, you need to make sure it doesn't conflict with your existing routing. From there, we did some more development configuration, set up foreman and live reload to have a better developer experience locally. Again, just trying to streamline everything. We went in and we fixed some of the typos in some of the tests. And then we started adding in sample data, right? Because to really run a Solidus store, we need that sample data from Solidus sample. And I will point out there that we've encountered there's really quite a bit of work that still needs to be done in making the Solidus sample data seeds idempotent. So right now, when you run those seeds more than once, you're going to encounter some errors. Daniel Portales on his team actually did some work on this previously, but he didn't address all of the sample data. It really only addressed the ones that we had needed to change as part of the work we were doing back whenever that was, a year ago or whatever. So we ended up having to do more of that same work, and that's kind of sprinkled throughout this history. But it's something really to pay attention to, that if you're adding in that sample data and you're running those seeds more than once, or that rake task, spree sample load, you're going to want to make sure that you don't end up with duplicates of all of this stuff. And you might want to add some simple checks. One easy way is to check whether or not we have any countries in the spree countries table, and then not running those seeds accordingly, even if they were triggered by some other process that might wrap those up. The next thing that was an interesting part of this project was deciding how to handle the relationship between products. This application that we had access to already actually had products existing in it. And we needed to figure out how to work with Solidus, being that we had these products. At first, when we were first pitching the project, we didn't think that there were going to be any like existing product models or anything like that. But we found out there were, and we had to like really consider how to handle that. One of the considerations that we thought was to actually replace the model. And instead of using what we call the marketplace model, the marketplace product model, we would use the spree product model. But after a lot of consideration, knowing that it would remove a lot of existing functionality and knowing that it would also involve hacking up Solidus a lot more and like mixing our concerns instead of separating them, eventually we decided, okay, we're just going to create a one-to-one relationship. And that created a whole spit of work that basically was keeping those models in sync in different ways between each other. Along the way, you might be thinking, well, what about users? And that's buried in a note somewhere, but it's one of the things that was really, and it's not, you can't see here, it's in one of the descriptions on the commits or something. You know, we had a great success with the user model, actually. We were able to use the Solidus configurable class and plug in our other user model that was already using devise, not Solidus off devise, but just devise. And after just a few more configurations, it was working beautifully. You know, originally we were thinking, oh, are we going to have to create spree users for all these existing users and run some kind of migration and have a foreign key or something set up to link them, whatever. No, we didn't have to do any of that. We're able to just simply use the configuration class, plug it in, include the methods that come along with spree user, such as current user, inside of that other model that was coming from the existing application, and everything works beautifully. You could log in, you could use the app, no worries. So that was a really nice win. So moving forward, we did just some little work, installed reports in the admin. I can't highly enough recommend that if you don't have any admin reporting inside your default Solidus admin, that you install Magma Labs' simple dash gem extension. It's really basic, but it's really perfect for just having something in the Solidus dashboard. If you currently have no reports tab and maybe you're doing everything in another system, as long as this doesn't slow down your production from a bunch of queries or anything like that, especially if you're on a smaller scale, the simple dash extension is awesome. We did some fixes. This application was deployed with Capistrano. That was a whole interesting set of challenges that I won't really get into. A lot of stuff related to the dependency. The double jQuery conflict is one that a lot of you have probably seen before, but it's of note that if you're getting problems with how things look in the JavaScript after you just installed Solidus in the existing app, this is probably a pretty good candidate for what's happening. Make sure you're not including jQuery more than once or that JUI or anything like that. This one is very interesting, the speed up marketplace. I was hoping to show you a code example here. Really, this was a one-line change and it involved the existing code, but I want to point out, it really was just about taking a select statement and changing it to a detect statement. So there was somewhere in there where they were doing a select and then doing a dot first on the result of that select. And simply by changing it to detect and using that method instead, the speed increase on this product listing page was like 60 seconds down to like 5 seconds. Huge. So if there's a page that's really slow or anything that you're having trouble with along those lines, like be on the lookout for unnecessary select statements. Those detects, if you really just need to find if it's there and return the value right away, it'll skip iterating through the rest of that array or the rest of that collection. Some more notes, some more seeding. We still never fixed the fact that orders were created during the sample load and just had to handle that a different way. Handled some stuff on the PDP, nothing really to say here. Added integration specs that acted as a like super spec. That was really important. We had to do a whole lot of updates to the CI, a whole lot of sample data creation on the existing application side. seeds that weren't there and figuring out models and all of that kind of stuff. But we eventually got it working with fixtures really nicely. So that was like check, check. You can imagine what went into that. Some of this other stuff is pretty straightforward, adding in the cart link. Of course, that's added in by default, but we can add that in separately into our new views. This build Solidus rake task, this starts to get into the idea of keeping those two different models in sync and running a job that basically is going to, when it sees a change, we put it on the after commit. It could be after save. Whenever that main marketplace product is changed, that will run this job to trigger whatever needs to be changed about the Solidus product. Again, this isn't great because we're almost keeping a point of truth in two places, but after a lot of thought, this was the best way within the current scope and the time constraints that we had to do it. I still think it would have been even better to somehow replace the model, but again, that would mix the concerns more, and it's also a lift that we just didn't at all have time for. I won't get into what drive is or what the drive objects are, but I will just say that we leveraged the event system, and it was awesome. It was really easy to use, and I can't highly enough recommend it for things that you need to do with Solidus. Here's where we ran into the difficulty from the caching. So the note about the caching is that if you're not careful and your CI is caching a bunch of your fixtures, and in one of your PRs or MRs or commits, you do something to mess up the building of those fixtures or the functionality that depends on them, but your cache is again set to not build them every time. Maybe it's set to cache based on an entire pipeline instead of on a specific branch or specific commit, which we do to speed up the build of the CI, right? Like we want that caching because we don't want to have to do all those steps every time. But if that's the case, you might run into a situation where you actually break your CI, but you won't know it until you make another change that requires rebuilding those cached assets, such as the fixtures. So this was really annoying and took about a day to resolve, but eventually we found the root source and we fixed it and we merged it in. But, you know, this failure is a huge lesson learned in terms of be careful with your caching. It might make more sense not to cache and have a more reliable test suite, or to cache less and have a more reliable test suite. That's kind of the conclusion we came to at the end. We added a new rake task to create admin roles. We also, as part of this project, extended the admin roles that are existing, and that was really cool and very easy to do. There's a whole, permission policy that you can create, and maybe at a future date in one of the meetups, I'll do this talk again and share some of that code made into a form that it can be shared. But this is really simple stuff, making a new view of the admin where you only see some tabs, which is very common. That's easy. That's not something that is a huge lift. That's like a day of work or less. If you want it to be really polished and everything to work exactly as you expect, I'm sure it would take more time than that. But if you're looking to just, hide the products tab, you can do that. And it's very configurable through the user policies. Just you need to create a custom policy there and then assign it to the user, of course, and load it during the initializer. Other interesting things. Sometimes the translations can conflict in an existing app, especially if they're overriding anything about that. And we made a change regarding that to make sure the translations worked. Testing is very important. We're down to the wire here and cutting a little bit of corners in terms of knowing that we were going to come back for a new scope and just getting things done. And this caused some extra headache down at the wire when we were preparing for some of our following demos, having to come in and fix something that we really shouldn't have had to fix. There's also a note here about 12-factor apps. and making sure that you're running on your production or staging server exactly what you're running locally. To boot, MariaDB is not a direct drop-in replacement for MySQL, which is what this app was using and what we were using on the staging server, but not locally, as it turned out, because of just the existing setup of what was there. And that can cause some ambiguity in some of the validations that you create, because not everything will be interpreted exactly the same way. And that caused a last minute bug for us. So again, take another look at making sure that everything is in complete alignment, from not just which database you're using, but like what database server and what version of that server are you running on your staging instance? Can you run that locally? And of course, virtualization and Docker and all this stuff helps with all these things. But on a lot of projects, especially an existing one that you come into, the Docker setup, even if it is there, probably is outdated and not working exactly correct. I mean, maybe that's a pessimistic view to take, but I've seen that happen on multiple occasions. And if you spend a really long time trying to get that Docker setup to work, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you end up with kind of something on the side where you're like, okay, we got to move on. The local development works great, and we can't continue to spend more time in this Docker setup because there's so many different layers that happen on top of it, right? So all of this is about just ensuring, no matter what kind of setup you're using, whether it's virtualization or not, that your database is exactly in sync and everything is to the nth degree. Other things to point out, of course, making sure all your Flash messages are showing. Some of this stuff, again, is really only applicable if you're thinking about installing Solidus in a fresh Rails app that might have customized things a whole bunch. Another thing that we had to note is changing the default currency to euros. So we were previously using US dollars, which is the default in Solidus, but we had to make a little bit of a change and say, okay, we're actually going to use euros by default, because if we're not going to do multi-currency, it's more important for this client to have euros in place. And so we did that set of changes at the end, but that's something, lessons learned, that we should think about from day one. Like when we're first installing Solidus, what currency are we going to use? Are we going to do multi-currency? Now, part of our idea was we were hoping to be able to include multi-currency in this, milestone delivery that we were having, but we weren't. And it would have been a better idea to like start with euros and then work on adding the multi-currency for US dollars, which is eventually what we came out with. Another thing is making sure that the references to all the routes work. This main app is important. You might be familiar with this, but if you're loading Solidus inside a separate mounting point, you're going to have to make sure that your main application's routes are prefaced with main app. Otherwise, they won't resolve correctly. And then there's a bunch of other little stuff, but I think that's a pretty good place to stop it. So hopefully this gave you some things to think about, even if we weren't looking directly at any of the code, in terms of making sure that you think through what we're doing in advance and don't just kind of have to approach it after the fact. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions or would like to talk more about any of this, please come find me after the lightning talks. Thank you.